Hello everyone, welcome back to my Form 5 Ethics class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. In this video we're going to take a look at question 19, Article 2, where Aquinas breaks from the pattern he established in question 18 and argues that the object is the only thing that matters for making the act of the will good or bad, that the end and the circumstances don't matter at all. So let's see how that works. We're going to take a closer look at this article than we did Article 1. Somehow, object is all we care about. The object of willing is all that matters. And so we need to ask, where does the end go and where do the circumstances go? Why are they excluded here? And that's what objections 1 and 2 are all about. They're not very complicated objections, and we're not going to look at the third one. There are two basic ways to prove, I think, that the object is the only thing that matters. One of them is the way that the objectors go. Objections 1 and 2 say, well, we've got object, circumstance, and end, but we're going to cut away end and circumstance, and the only thing left is object. We're done. That's probably the easier way to understand this article for a beginner. The respondeo gives a very principled reason why it has to only be one thing, and that argument's a lot more difficult, but we're still going to look at it. So objection 1. It would seem that the goodness of the will does not depend on the object alone, so obviously it's going to. For the end has a closer relationship to the will than to any other power. But the acts of the other powers derive goodness not only from the object, but also from the end, as we've shown above in question 18, Article 4. Therefore, the act also of the will derives goodness not only from the object, but also from the end. The end is more closely related to the will, going back to question 8, Article 2, than it is to anything else. It's the object of the will. So if the end matters for all those things moved by the will, surely it has to matter for the will itself. Where does the end go? That ends up being the most important question, and it's not directly addressed in the respondeo. It's why the reply to objection 1 is extremely important. Objection 2 just asks us to take a look back at the really nice sed contra in Article 3 of question 18, where Aristotle said that the virtuous person acts when he should, where he should, how he should, etc. And by contrast, the vicious person when he shouldn't, where he shouldn't, etc. This is a very nice sed contra. Why doesn't that still apply here? That's really all we have in this objection. Neither objection is very technical. They're just asking us to look back at what we've already read and explain why we're not going to use the same reasoning. Why can't we say, as I've bolded here in the text, that a virtuous person wills when he should, where he should, and as much as he should, or, by contrast, the vicious person wills when he shouldn't, where he shouldn't, and so on and so forth? Why can't we just change from action to willing? Sed contra is a bit strange. It asks us to take a look back at question 18, Article 10, which was a fairly subtle discussion of whether or not circumstances place an action in the species of good or evil. An action does not take its species from the circumstances as such, which was proven in question 18, Article 10. But good and evil are specific differences of the act of the will, as we just said in Article 1 of this question. And so the goodness and malice of the will depend not on the circumstances, but on the object alone. So question 18, Article 10 probably needs a very quick recap at this point. Circumstances can actually specify an action, but only when they're not really just circumstances anymore. The reasoning is a little bit interesting. We don't have time to go over all of it again. But basically, what counts as a mere circumstance in some cases can actually become part of the object and further specify the object in other cases. And when circumstances do that, as Aquinas says, when they become principal conditions of the object, then they do, in fact, place an action into the species of good or evil. But at that point, they're not properly speaking circumstances anymore. And that's why we've bolded the as such. Circumstances as such can't specify. Okay. And when you connect that with what we said in Article 1, that seems reasonable. But what about the end? The sed contra is confidently excluding circumstances from consideration, but it's almost like we're pretending the end isn't a thing. It doesn't matter. It's the great mystery of the article. What's going to happen? The respondio is pretty difficult. It's a lot of fun to explain. I really enjoy this one. However, we are going to have a small problem in order of presentation. I think Aquinas' order of presentation is a little strange, and I'm going to change it slightly. Possibly that means my order of presentation is incorrect. I'm happy to be wrong about that. So let's read it, and then we'll try to grapple with a couple of ideas here. In every genus, the more a thing is first, the simpler it is, and the fewer the principles of which it consists. Thus, primary bodies are simple. Hence, it is to be observed that the first thing in every genus is in some way simple and consists of just one principle, or the first things in every genus. So we're going to talk about genus and species again, and we need to get into the idea of what Aquinas means, what Aristotle means by genus and species again. In every genus, the more a thing is first, the simpler it is, and the fewer the principles of which it consists. Is there an intuitive, easy way to get into this without just sort of doing all of the hard labor of getting into what Aquinas means by genus and species? Maybe thinking about the periodic table of elements. The first of the elements is the simplest. Maybe in any kind of building block domain, anytime you're talking about things that are built of fundamental parts, as you get to the fundamental parts, they're simple. Right? That's what it means to be the fundamental part or the principle. Maybe something having to do with electrons, subatomic particles. Maybe there's other things we could do. Maybe we should escape from chemistry a little bit. That might be going in the wrong direction. It would be nice if we could just hand wave this and invoke the first mover argument. Hopefully, this language of the more a thing is first, the simpler it is, evokes things that we talked about in Form 3 when we did divine attributes. As soon as we're done with the 5 ways proving that God exists as a first mover and an uncaused cause, the first divine attribute is to prove that God is simple. When you're working your way through the first mover argument, when you're starting with some changing thing in the universe, some effect, you're looking at a composite, and as you trace your way back to the first mover, you are looking at things that are less and less composed. There's less mixture of act and potency until at the end you have something that's absolutely simple. The absolute first. Now, Aquinas doesn't think that there's anything in the universe that's absolutely simple. That's only true of God. Things in the universe are relatively simple. Even hydrogen is in some sense composite. Even an electron is in some sense composite, or a quark. But relative to everything else that comes from it, or that it builds, it's simple. So it's nice if you can see the connection to the first mover argument. That's handy, perhaps. What we actually need to do is talk a little bit about first in a genus and simplicity of principle. So simplicity of principle you can think of in terms of parts. Matter and form are principles of a substance. But I want to start with first in a genus. Aquinas takes a slightly different tack here, and either I'm misunderstanding part of the move he makes, which is very possible, or I have to explain something out of order so that we can make some progress here. So I actually want to look at the second block of text on the left there. That one thing, which is the principle in each genus, is not something accidental to that genus, but something essential to it. Because whatever is accidental is reduced to something essential as to its principle. We want to take a look at some genus and species stuff here. If I propose to you the genus hot things, we could make a list of things that are hot. I've created a very silly, very non-exhaustive list of hot things over here. Lava, fire, boiling water, whatever. And the game that we would typically play in a classroom is, what's the hottest thing? And be careful. I don't just mean something that is, as it turns out, it happens to be the hottest thing, right? There's some star somewhere, or some star cradle, perhaps. Or we could maybe talk about there was the temperature or the heat of the universe in the instant after the Big Bang. That's just a number of some kind. But we actually want to talk about, in some sense, that than which nothing hotter can be thought, to evoke some St. Anselm language from our good old proslogian days in Form 3. So what's the hottest thing in the genus hot? And part of what we want to say here is that the first thing in the genus is what makes everything else be a member of the genus. It's the thing that's essentially hot, or essentially X, whatever the genus is. And all of the other things are in some way members of that class by participation in it, somehow. It doesn't even make sense to say that something can be hotter than this first thing. I mean, perhaps some star out there in the universe could be a little hotter. Could be. It's just not. Whatever would go at the top of the list of, from boiling water to fire to lava to this star and that star and another. But the first thing isn't like that. What's the thing that makes everything else hot? And so you couldn't ever say it's hot, there's something hotter than this. It's heat. It's the hot itself. The essentially hot. Now, if you would like to feel a little more modern, if you're feeling a little nervous about Aquinas' science, well, then we can talk about molecular motion. We can make it as Chem 101 as you like, until you're comfortable. A molecular motion of some kind, energy of some kind. Right? It's molecular motion that makes things hot. Nothing's hotter than molecular motion. That doesn't even mean anything. Lava and fire, meaning in a fire pit, or boiling water, they're all composite somehow. They're things, that have molecular motion. But molecular motion is simpler, right? Well, now we want to apply this to the category that we're interested in. Voluntary acts, or as Aquinas calls them here, human acts. Those are synonymous. He probably could have made that slightly clearer. The principle of the goodness and malice of human actions is taken from the act of the will. Because running and skiing and studying and eating and anything else you could put on that list, sure, they're voluntary. But the first thing in the genus that makes those things voluntary is the act of the will itself. Because independently of the act of the will, running, it's not voluntary. It's executive, right? There are some things that it's really, really clear that you can have them happen without any act of will, like falling or sleeping. So the act of the will is the first thing in the genus of voluntary actions, and it's a member of that genus in the way heat is a member of the genus hot things, very differently than the way everything else in the list belongs there. And since it's first in the genus, and it's the essence of the genus, and it's what makes everything else be part of the genus, it's simple. And therefore, the goodness of the will's act depends on just one thing, and we've already identified it. The object. That thing which of itself causes goodness in the act. That one thing is the object, not the circumstances, which are accidents, as it were, of the act. Acts are specified by their object. Remember, question 18, Article 5, again, and Article 2, and 6, and 7. We spent a lot of time on that. Acts are specified by their object. Aquinas gets a lot of mileage out of that. All the stuff we did with species and essential determinations that we've now repeated many times comes back to this. It must depend on just one thing, which creates that essential difference. That's what the object does. So, hey, we're done. That was easy, but a little heady. It was sort of theoretical, right? Could we have done this a little bit more easily? Well, what about the end? Where the heck did it go? Time to go to reply to objection 1. That first sentence is so important. And it reminds me in a way of question 6, article 1, reply to objection 1. Not every principle is a first principle. You just have to see it. And once you see it, lots of things make sense. The end is the object of the will. It didn't disappear at all. We've actually already said this in question 18, article 6. So if you read this article and knew this was coming, good job. You've learned some Aquinas. That's not bad. The end is the object of the will. The end is the object of the will. The end is the object of the will. Just repeat it. Very easy. Very easy. It's not but not of the other powers, right? The end is not the object of the other powers. So when it comes to the act of the will, the goodness derived from the object does not differ from the goodness which is derived from the end, as they do differ in other powers. They're the same. Very easy, never forget it. But now I have to talk about the last part there, that little qualifier. Except perhaps accidentally, insofar as one end depends on another, and one act of the will on another. So we'll talk about this one in class. I'm sure I will get grilled on this in class, because this does require a little bit of talking through. And I don't want to make this video a lot longer than it needs to be. But as I tell my students, you got to remember to follow the bouncing ball. In this act of the will, what you are willing is an end in some way. Maybe there is some reason that you're willing it. It's depending on some other act of the will. Notice that would be a means-end kind of relationship. But as soon as you try to examine that, you're actually looking at a different act of the will now. This is what he means by except perhaps accidentally. You're switching from talking about one willing to a different willing. Still, that part's tricky. And I'm just going to keep repeating the mantra of the first sentence, and we can try to talk through that last little qualifier later on. So the very easy answer is that the end doesn't disappear. Object and end collapse into the same thing for the act of the will in question 19. That's cool. Where'd circumstances go? Okay. So that's a pretty long reply. I believe it's longer than the respondeo. Pretty long. And we are going to break it down for two reasons. First of all, it does clarify the respondeo a little bit, and we do want to know what's going on with circumstances. That's worth knowing. Right? That principled reply in the respondeo itself, that's maybe not the most practical thing. It's cool, or at least I think it's cool. But if you want to talk about object, circumstance, and end, maybe not the most helpful. So we do want the content here. But also, the move that's being made here is a move that you've seen before. So let's look at this over the course of a few slides, I think 3 slides. Given that the act of the will is fixed on some good, so for the objection and the reply, we're assuming that the object is good, and the question is, can you have some sort of circumstance that makes that good willing bad? And the answer is no, impossible. No circumstance can make that act bad. Wow. Consequently, when it is said that a man wills a good when he should not, or where he should not, this can be understood in 2 ways. So we've got a distinction. And this is virtually identical to the negation game that we played in question 6, article 3, objection 2. And one of the reasons that I made a big deal out of that a couple of months ago, several videos ago, was so that you could do this. If you remember how that game worked, we were taking a basic proposition, I want to read, or I want to do something. I want to X. It doesn't matter what X is. And the objector was incorrectly applying the negative, because you can negate that sentence, that proposition, in 2 different ways. And the objector was collapsing them into the same thing. We have something very similar here. We're just not using a negation. We're going to use when at the wrong time, right? At some bad time. So the circumstance has to be bad in some way for this objection to work, or the reply to the objection to work. And we'll play the same game. Apply that circumstance at the wrong time to the proposition, I want to X. And you put anything you want in there for X. Sleep, pray, study, read, whatever. It doesn't matter. What are the 2 ways we can negate it? What are the 2 ways we negate it? Or what are the 2 ways we can modify it? What are the 2 ways we negated back in question 6, article 3? Well, you have 2 verbs, or you have 2 things. You can modify the wanting, and you can modify the X, the other verb, the doing. And Aquinas is going to start with modifying X. The first way you can understand the circumstance is that it is referred to the thing willed, meaning you're modifying X. And I've expressed it there on the left with the brackets. We've taken I want to X, and we have modified X with at the wrong time. And I've bracketed it to try to show you something very simple. Everything in the brackets, X at the wrong time, that's the object of the will. That's what you're willing. If I say, what are you willing? It's X at the wrong time. Perhaps it's helpful if you hyphenate it. Well, X at the wrong time is an object. The circumstances have collapsed into the object. This is very much the way, very similar to what Aquinas was talking about in question 18, article 10, where the circumstances become a principal condition of the object. Thus, the act of the will is not fixed on a good, since willing to do something when it ought not be done, as one big hyphenated object, that's not willing a good. Your object is evil. So, down this first branch, the circumstances collapse into the object, and the object's evil. The other option is to modify the wanting, so that the circumstances refer to the act of willing. And now we're putting at the wrong time on the willing. You're willing it at the wrong time. I want at the wrong time to do X. And thus it is impossible to will a good when you shouldn't, because you should always will what is good. This is quite a surprising turn at the end there. Oh, it's always right to will a good. If it's good, you should will it. Never a wrong time. Never, ever. Interesting. Now, we do again have this except perhaps accidentally qualification. This one is a little easier to see than the previous one that we looked at. So when you are willing something, it's taking up your mental space. You're thinking it, you're willing it. That means that at that moment, there's some other thing, in fact, there's an infinite number of things you're not thinking about and you're not willing, not while you're willing that one. So it could be the case that accidentally, by willing one good, you are prevented from willing another. But in that case, the evil that's going on is the not willing of the other, not the willing of this good at this time. I won't say it again. You can just rewind the video if you want to hear it again. We can also talk about it in class. You can spend a little time on that. You should always will goods. And when that interferes with willing some other good that you should be willing, like maybe thinking about doing your homework while you should be praying or something like that, you have one mental operation preventing the doing of another mental operation. It's not that willing to do your homework is bad. It's not that thinking about your homework is bad. It's that not praying is bad. So either a circumstance just is part of the object. It's not a circumstance. It doesn't matter. Or I shouldn't say it doesn't matter. It's just part of the object. So it disappears in that sense. Or you mean that circumstances are modifying the willing, in which case they never matter, ever. And the last thing I would say about this reply is this almost comical hand waving at the end. The same applies to the other circumstances. Yeah, all the others, it works the same way. I wouldn't mind seeing some examples there. That's a pretty big, I don't know if it's a big claim. I think it's right, but perhaps we should spend a little bit of time working through how, where, and how much, and the rest do matter. This is where you go back to question 7, where Aquinas listed the kinds of circumstances that we look at when we do ethics, and you run down the list. And you would show, hopefully, maybe, that they'll all cash out in exactly the same way. They're either going to modify X, in which case you're just talking about the object, or they're going to modify the act of the will, in which case they're not going to matter. And therefore, end just becomes object, and circumstances end up not mattering, and all we're left with is just the object. We only measure the act of the will by its object. Emphatically. Does it depend on the object? Yes. Does it depend on the object alone? Yes. It depends on nothing else. And that's why it's going to be a little bit comical in Article 3 when he asks if it does depend on something else. You got to have a little sense of humor when you read Aquinas. But we're going to stop here. Next up will be Articles 3 and 4, which we'll tackle at the same time in one video. They're not as hard. And that's where we're going to start talking about measuring the act of the will and how all this to be in accord with reason stuff works. In the meantime, if you have any questions about this video or its contents, you know how to get a hold of me. And in the meantime, good luck with your studying, and God bless.